Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's very special webinar, as it's the first one on Capture 120. So I've been biting my tongue for quite some time now about this new release. So it's fine to, or great, I should say, to finally start talking about it. So that's what we're going to do today. Before we get to that, just a little bit of housekeeping. So the maximum amount of time that we have allowed is 1 hour. We might not need all of that, but we certainly won't overrun. I am recording this webinar, so we will be able to show you a recording around tomorrow sometime, and that just goes up on our Learning Hub, same page to where you last signed up for it. You're very welcome and encouraged to submit your questions at any time, and also enjoy the chat, which most of you have discovered already. Now the chat is public, so of course be nice to each other, which I'm sure you will anyway. Now the chat room, of course, you've discovered that. If you want to ask a question, it makes much more sense if you put that directly in the Q&A tab. The reason for that is that I've also got Andre as part of our team assisting in the background as well. And he will try and answer as many questions as possible. There is rather a lot of you at the moment. I can see the numbers rising up. So please don't be offended if your particular question we don't get to. We're in the hundreds today, so we won't be able to get to everything. So I'll try and answer questions related to Capture 120, and then Andre in the background will try and mop up anything else as well if he can. But we'll do our best between us to try and answer as much as possible. Now, if asking questions or chatting is not your thing, then using those keys in the top right hand corner, you can hide or collapse that chat window, and that will give you a bit more real estate on screen. So that's enough of that. Without further ado, let's move on and look at Capture 120. So this update was out last week. The main purpose of this update was to make Capture One more accessible, easier to use, clean up some of the workflow annoyances, and make some important changes to the UI as well. So the first subject that we're going to talk about is actually the UI itself. So let's get rid of my face for a second so we can see Capture One in its entirety. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is this, which for the UI is the scrolling tools. Now in Capture 112 it was somewhat annoying, because if you had limited space on your screen, you would get to the point where Capture One would start collapsing and expanding tools which you didn't really have much control over, and that of course meant that you had to design different workspaces, perhaps split up your tools into various different work tabs and so on, and also meant that you had to close and unclose when you perhaps didn't want to. So now what happens is that we have a scrolling area, as you can see, which you can fit much more tools on if you want to, and we also have this pinned area at the top as well, and it's easy to move tools in between those. So we have the pinned area, as I said, and the scrollable area, and if you want to, you can either just drag tools between those two areas. So now I have a smaller scrolling area and a larger fixed area, or you can click on the three dots and say move to scrollable, or if it's already in the pinned, we can move it like so. Nice little UI change. Now if you're not seeing that, you might need to go back to your default workspace and then customize from there as well if you want to. So just give that a try, but it does help the workflow much more. Couple of other UI points before we come on to the tools. For new users amongst you, not so useful, I guess, or maybe could be useful for the existing users, but now by default we actually write under what each icon is. So before you could only see the icon, which was pretty unhelpful for new users if you had no idea what was in our mindset when we designed all these pretty looking icons. So now you actually see what's written underneath. And as someone pointed out, it whizzed past on the chat. That was Dave, I think, Dave Haberman. Hi, Dave. What happened to the auto function? It's still there, but instead of an A, it's now the traditional magic wand. It doesn't make a nice sound when you press it, unfortunately, but that's now the auto icon, which you'll find in the various different tools. just the second icon along, but it's the same as what it did before. It's just a different icon. Okay, finishing with the UI, let's turn on Proof View. That's this button here. If you don't know what that does, it just gives you a bit more space around the photo. Now, previously, if you wanted to change this background color, you'd have to go into Capture One's preferences, mess around in there, come out of the preferences, and so on. Now, anywhere in this dark area, we can right click and then we can choose a different background color. So if I'm sending something to print, sometimes it's quite nice to be able to see the background as well. Or sorry, a lighter background, so it's easier to judge your print. And then a right click, and then we can just go back. So just a small little change. Few other final UI tweaks. We've now brought the brushes down here in the Layers tool. So in this tool, you can now see the visible cursor icons as opposed to hiding them into another submenu, which isn't very helpful. And in the process recipes, there's now a process button in the recipe tool itself, rather than having to scroll down all the way to this tool at the bottom, the process summary. So that brings sort of all the various little UI tweaks that we've done, the biggest of those being the scrolling tools, of course, which just makes navigating much quicker. All right, let's move on to some of the new tools, which is where it gets more exciting. So let's have a look at the color editor, and in particular the basic color editor. Whoop, basic, there we go. So let's just bring me up for a second. So previously in Capture One, we've always had basic, advanced, skin tone being designed just for editing skin and actually other things. Advanced giving you the ability to really set the color range and saturation range of the colors you want to edit. And then finally, the tab we're looking at now, which is the basic tab, which is kind of your fast go-to tool for quick color editing. Now, the way it worked previously in Capture One was really not the most compact of setups. It took up a lot of space, and really the different ranges and sliders didn't have a great deal of impact, so it wasn't super simple to use. So now there's quite a lot of additional functionality in this. Instead of 6 color ranges as it was before, there's now 8. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and one patch. This one here, which is the entire color range, where you can shift the hue and saturation. So the redesign is to make it faster and easier to use, and actually have more impact as well. So a couple of different ways you can use it. So you can either pick the patch that you want to edit. Notice that the sliders are dynamic, so they instantly change to the color that you're going to edit, and you can see the impact, what's going to happen on those sliders. So let's just drag saturation down, for example. That reduces the blue, or in the other direction, that makes it more saturated. So that's fairly easy to comprehend, I'm sure. Let's switch to another shot for a second. Let's grab this one and look at a different method. So I'm sure you all understand how that works, but there's an additional benefit here with the direct color editor. So that's this picker down here in the bottom right hand corner of the basic color editor. So this means now really you can use this in a couple of different ways. You can go over onto your photo and click once, and that will show you the color patch that you need to edit. So then I can manually go ahead and adjust like so. Or the other way that you can use it is to go over onto the color that you want to edit and click and hold. Now watch what happens when I click and hold is that momentarily a little four-way cursor pops up and disappears. And what this means is that I can either drag horizontally, so I can drag in a horizontal plane, or I can drag in a vertical plane with my cursor, and I'm still holding it down. So now if I start moving to the left, if you look at the color editor over to my left, you'll see now it's identified 2 color patches that fit well with the color that I've clicked on. So if I drag to the left, that's going to tweak the hue like so, as you can see. If I drag up and down, that's going to change the saturation, as you can see, for that color range. Now there's 3 planes, so we've also got lightness. So how do I affect lightness? So if I hold my Option key down, or Alt key as you might know it, and drag up and down, that's now going to change my lightness like so. So you can very quickly go over to a color, click and hold, then think, let's bump up the saturation on this, and then drag it down and darken it a little bit, or do the opposite, and so on. So it's a super fast way for editing colors, and the benefit of using that click direct color editor is that it can pick more than one color at the same time, giving you a better color change. Now, if you don't want to use those default settings, when your cursor is in Capture One's viewer, do a right click, and then you can bring up the direct color editor settings. So by default, it's horizontal, vertical, option vertical. I actually prefer to have my lightness on the vertical scale, and I prefer to have hue with an option click. So you can mess around with that as you prefer. And sensitivity wise, this is really how much, how exaggerated your mouse or pen movements have to be. So the more sensitive it is, the less you have to drag your mouse around. I saw someone just flip past because I forgot to mention this earlier. So I saw on the chat, can you mask that operation? Yes. So that's something that was added in this release as well, that the basic color editor works on a layer, which it didn't do before. So it meant you always had to go to the advanced color editor. Again, the advanced color editor is great, but if you want to do a quick, snappy, fast color edit, you can now do so in the basic tool, and it now works on a layer as well. So it's a super, super nice addition. One thing that you can do, now we spent quite a bit of time figuring out the color ranges to actually work really well for like skin tones and other photographic things, but you can actually tweak those different color ranges if you wish, and you can see what each of those ranges is picking up as well, and you can reset to default. So that's the little box there. If you want to edit those ranges, chances are you probably won't have to. Okay, let's carry on with tools. So let's have a look at the improved crop tool. Excuse me. So it might sound a weird thing to talk about cropping, but who crops their photos? Everybody. So it should be the best experience that it can be. So now what you can see is we have visible handles, but quite a nice little UI touch is that they disappear when you adjust the crop. So now I can drag from the corner, or I can drag from the edge. Now a couple of obvious things that should always have been in Capture One is the ability to lock the aspect ratio. How do you do that? Hold down Shift, and then now I can lock the aspect ratio to the aspect that it was before I started moving the crop guides. Equally, if I hold my Option key down, that's going to lock around the center. So that's actually a great tool for just changing the edit on a portrait a bit if you've got them nice and centered, but just want to squeeze it down a bit. Option click on the corner works really nicely as well, and then it will crop around the center. Now, something that we haven't really mentioned in marketing tools or marketing information is that the ability to rotate on the corner has always been there, but in the past the speed of it has been a bit clunky, or it doesn't really, if I sort of try and demonstrate, it's a bit jerky when you were trying to rotate it. So trying to get like just a little adjustment of rotation was kind of tricky because it would jump around a fair bit. Now if you had a super speedy computer, you probably didn't really notice this. If you're on a slower machine, I think it would have been much more apparent. So you might find that your rotation by just going to the edge of the crop is much, much quicker. It certainly is on my machine. This is a 2016 MacBook Pro, so it's by no means slow, but it didn't have the best cropping performance. Now it's much, much, much cleaner. But as I said, we didn't mention it because some of you might experience an improvement, some it might already be good anyway. Now, someone asked this morning as well, in terms of changing the background and other things, I won't go through all of it, but if you look in the preferences, there's tons of ways how you can manipulate how the crop boundaries look and when the handles appear and so on and so forth. So just have a little look in there to see if you want to optimize it. All right, let's have a quick little look at, see if there's any questions related to Capture 120. 1 second. Noise reduction we're going to come to, Terence, because that's a new improvement in Capture 1. Let's see. Can you multi-select color patches in the color editor without using the eyedropper? You know what? I don't think you can. I've never tried it, but let's... I think it's one or other. Yeah, so I've just tried a shift click out of interest, but you can't. So if you click, then it will select those multiple patches. The patches are not based on the image. So you'll see, look, Alan was asking that. If we go to a different shot, let's just bring up the color patches again. So they're not based on the photo, they're the same, but when we click to adjust the color range, so if I click and hold and tweak, you see then it identifies those two ranges, for example, like so. There we go. So it's a really little handy addition, as I said. Let's see about any other Capture 120 questions. Let's see. How do I get Capture 120 to see my catalogs from the previous version? Dead easy. I think people expect it to be complicated. File, open, point to your Capture 1 catalog from 12, 11, 10 or whatever. It will run through an upgrade process, but that's it. They're not embedded into Capture 1. I think that's the misconception. You can see the last 10 or so catalogs that you opened here, but it's in no way embedded into the application. It's just like opening a Word document, for example. So you're simply doing a file open operation. Is it possible to scroll the values on the slider? Yeah, last question, because this came up a bit. So now, before you could use the scrolly wheel on your mouse to change the sliders, you can still do that. So if I use my mouse instead, but you have to hold down the Alt key and then, oops, helps if you don't right click, and then you can use scrolling like so. Now, if you want the old method back in Capture One's preferences, under General, we've got scroll wheel changes slider value, and then Alt will allow you to scroll the tools. So you can flip the operation to the old method if you like. All right, let's move on. So thanks for those Capture 120 questions. And what we're going to talk about now, we're going to talk about, oh, one other little crop thing for anyone on Lightroom out there, or Capture One for that matter, because I find myself doing it now. On Capture One, you don't really have to apply a crop. Once it's cropped, it's cropped. To remove or to see the image how it's cropped, the idea is you just move to a different cursor tool. But now if you tap Enter on the keyboard, then it will apply the crop and actually choose your pan tool for you. So if you're used to, with your muscle memory, making a crop and tapping Enter, now it's the same experience in Capture One. Okay, let's have a look at noise reduction. As I said, we were going to talk about that. Let's go to our excited guy working out here, for example. Let's hide our browser so we've got a bit more space. And let's check our exposure for a second. Exposure's down here. Let's just move you up a little bit. So we've got two shots, and we're going to bring out the base characteristics tool because there's an important distinction here. We're going to zoom in to 100%. Now on the left is Capture 120. On the right hand side you can see we've got Capture 112. Now this is an important thing to know. If you've opened some of your older catalogs into Capture 120, you'll notice the engine will always say Capture 112, or if it's an older version, Capture 111, for example. So by default, we don't update the processing engine. And the reason for that is that when we update processing engines, it can change colors subtly, contrast, and so on. Now on this update, the processing engine is 99% about the noise reduction and some HDR stuff. But we still don't upgrade it. That's the policy. So to get the new noise reduction look on your photos, you'll need to hit the upgrade button. You can select all and do it in a batch if you want to, or just do it case by case if you want to reprocess some old stuff. Okay, so what's the difference in the noise reduction? Very important. Let's get me out the way. So first of all, you see on the left, Capture 120, on the right, left, Capture 120, on the right, Capture 112. First thing, look at the difference in color rendition. Why is that? As the ISO gets higher, so this is at 3200, it actually gets harder and harder to determine accurate color. Certainly when it comes to shadows and highlights, even more so. So there's less information for us to work with, but improving those algorithm means that we now get more consistent, accurate color at those higher ISOs. So you see a skin tone has gone kind of a bit wild in the center here. It's much too red compared to this one. And this is without changing anything on the settings. All I've done is bump up the exposure a bit. So we've brightened the exposure slightly, but otherwise everything is as it came out of camera. So same white balance and so on. So that's really the first important distinction. That color is already much better. The second one is really, let's look at some crunchy stuff in the background, and let's go and find our noise reduction tool. The second one is that the impact of the noise reduction sliders has a much greater effect. So let's say we just want to clean up this noise a bit more. I can push this slider up, for example, and it does a really nice job of cleaning up the background. Now, I appreciate you're watching on a webinar transmission, which might not be the bestest quality in the world, but it certainly has a much nicer and greater effect at removing that noise compared to Capture 112. But it is really important that you keep an eye out what the engine says, and that you do adjust the noise reduction sliders if you wish. So let's have a look at another example. Let's grab this one. So same thing, let's hide our browser, let's zoom to 100%, let's find something noisy. Let's see, what should we look at? Let's look at our couple over here, for example. Let's look at our couple over here. Let's bump up the exposure a bit. It's a bit on the dark side. So let's brighten up somewhat. Let's really push it and copy that across. So let's put him over. First of all, again, on the left is Capture 120, on the right is Capture 112. Look at the difference. Let's put heads together. Look at the difference in skin tone as well. So much cleaner going on the left. You can see, at least I can on my screen, the sort of crunchier detail in Capture 112, already cleaner and more uniform on 20. And once again, if we bump up the noise reduction, we can clean that up quite nicely as well. So don't be afraid to play with the sliders. We do try to keep a good balance between noise reduction and detail, probably erring on the side of caution for noise reduction, but you can bump it up. Russell's great idea. If you want to run my test, what you have to do is, if you go to preferences, you can set the processing engine to, you can go all the way back to Capture 1.6 if you want, wouldn't advise it. You can set the processing engine to a different default, and if you make a new variant, that'll make it with the old processing engine. So then you can compare before and after as well. Alrighty, okay, so that's noise reduction. Do have a play with that. Now the HDR tool, let's have a look at this. Oh, I missed it out in my list here. So let's go and find. Sorry, I updated my catalog earlier, but I forgot to include a little handy album which had, let's just hide my viewer, 1 second. Let's get rid of you. Let's put base characteristics away. And let's just grab a different photo. let's grab this guy. He's quite a good example of HDR. All right, so in my high dynamic range tool down here, let's put exposure back there as well. High dynamic range, let's just straighten him, otherwise that's going to bother me looking at something wonky. There we go, that's better. Let's just brighten him up a little and cool him down a bit. There we go. So now with our high dynamic range tool, we've got two new sliders, which are really important to talk about in a second, and a change to the highlight and shadow operations. Now in the past, or Capture One 12 and before that, excuse me, was kind of backward, because the highlight and shadow sliders started at 0 and you could only go positively up to 100. So it was sort of backward to all the other sliders, because if you wanted to darken highlights, you had to push the slider positively, which is kind of a bit weird when you think about it. So now the slider starts in the middle, as it should, and you can go darker to the left or brighter to the right. So in this case, if we wanted to get more detail back into our highlights, we would go in this direction and then we recover the highlights in the window, as you can see. But if I want more dynamic contrast, then we can also brighten the highlights should we wish to. So very straightforward. Same for the shadows. If we want to open up the shadows, we go in this direction. If we want to darken the shadows, we can go in this direction. Now we come to the two sliders, the whites and the blacks. So these are quite interesting and very different from really any other slider in Capture One, or any other sort of method of trying to achieve the same thing. So I'm just going to grab this photo because it does a good job of demonstrating what I mean. Let's just fix my crop. Let's get a bit more of the shot in. Get rid of the boot. Let's do that. And let's just edit this quickly. So this is how it is straight out of camera. Let's go to levels and hit auto. I think I might just make it slightly darker, have a bit more contrast, and let's throw in some clarity as well. So there's the sort of beginnings of my edit. Now let's turn on exposure warnings, so we can see if we're going to start to clip any blacks or whites or anything like that. So first of all, I just drop the highlights down a little bit just to get a bit more detail in the zebra crossing. Shadows is fine, but what the black and whites do is that they deal with the very sort of finer ends of the histogram. So right at the end of the histogram, if I imagine the histogram is on top of me, right at the end, the really darkest tones and the really brightest tones. And then we can change, we can just darken those a little bit or lift them a little bit, but it's right at either end of the scale, the really darkest tones and the very brightest tones. So let's say I just want to richen and darken my blacks a little bit. I can grab my black slider and start to pull this down, and then you can see where it starts to clip, but I can be quite aggressive before it starts to clip. And even if I just bump up my exposure a little and then bring those blacks down, you see I'm already at -47, and if we click on black you can see before and after, and I can get nice richer deeper tones but without really clipping too much. And just to check, if we look in my preferences, we can see my shadow warning is set to 4, so even if I reduce this a bit more, say down to 2, you can see I can push this slider quite a lot before it starts to clip. So now we get nice darker sort of richer tones, improves the contrast, but we don't clip anything. So let's reset that and counteract the argument, well, I could do the same with the levels tool, which you can't. So if I grab the black point here and think I can do the same thing, as soon as I bring that in, just like a few points, we're clipping and losing data already, which means there's going to be no data here, so it's going to be solid black and not look that great. So you can't do the same in the levels tool. Okay, what about the color balance tool? I've also heard. So if we go to the shadow luminosity slider and try and do the same thing, then it's not as severe, but very quickly we start to clip again. So that doesn't work either. So let's go back to the black slider. What about the curves tool? Well, yes, you could futz about and you could try to play around with the curve like we can do so, and it's not as severe, but it's still not as easy as doing that. So it's a speed and performance optimization as well, that you can drag that black slider, get nice sort of control of the contrast, but without ruining your detail as well. Same goes for the white. It's really this top of right at the far end of the histogram where we can brighten those brightest tones. You can see it's starting to clip there, or we can darken those down as well. Again, you can push this slider quite hard before it starts to clip. Again, if we go to our levels and I pull this in, then we're clipping data with smaller changes. So Bill, it's not the same as using levels, as you can see. So you can be much more aggressive with this, and it's fast and it's simple to use as well. Okay, let's see, have a quick scan down the Q&A for any Capture 120 related questions. Can you explain the difference in highlight reduction slider between 12 and 20? It's the same. There's no change to the algorithm for highlights. The range is actually a bit compressed. Oh, it's not actually. It's still 100. But there's no actual change to the algorithm in highlight recovery. So the changes are to whites and blacks, and the fact that they now start at 0, and you can go either way. But there's no change to the algorithm. How did I bring up that little navigator? Actually, that's not Capture 120, but it's handy. If you have the pan tool open, so the hand, press Control, and you get a little navigator. How cool is that? It's a really handy little shortcut for just zipping around an image if you're not sure where something is. So Control with the pan tool. Excuse me. Let's have a look. The new engine interprets skin tones more yellow. Nope, no change to the engine in terms of profiling or anything like that. But the difference you see between those two, if that's what you're referring to, is that, remember, I hadn't changed white balance, so I could take the warm tones out by changing the white balance. The difference is really how the improvement in the noise reduction interprets colors better. So it's not a case of this is warmer, it's just pulling out the correct colors if that was shot at like ISO 100 or something like that. Okay, I think that covers a few of those questions. Again, if we don't get to your specific question, I am sorry. There is, wow, it's actually a record number of shots, a record number of people. So we're doing our best between me and Andre. Thanks, Andre. All right, just checking the notes. Let's have a look at copy and apply for layers. So let's bring up this handsome fella here and talk about this kind of situation. So what we've got on this shot is I've got a skin tone edit on a layer. So if I press M to see my mask, then you can see the mask here, like so. And I've also got a mask over the whole shot, which is just a color grade. So that's a little play around with a color balance tool and a reduction in opacity just to play with the impact. So we've got two layers, and then the rest of the photos in the sequence, they have a skin tone edit, obviously with their own masks, as you can see. But what I would like to do, of course, is to get my color grade from this photo to the remaining 3 photos. Now, in Capture 112, you couldn't actually do this, because what would happen if I did a copy paste of my photo here to the remaining 3, it would actually overwrite all the other layers. So I would lose my skin tone edits that I'd spent all that time doing. So what we can do now is choose which layer goes to the other photos and retain the original layers that were there. So very simple. Let's select all. Click on the copy apply button in the layers tool itself. Say I only want the color grade, like so, and then say apply. And now if we look at the other shots, you can see it's got the color grade like so, and the mask, of course, over the whole shot, and also my opacity change as well. So that's just a really nice, much requested addition of workflow from the user base out there as well. Okay, so that's a change to our copy and apply layers. How are we doing for time? Good. All right, let's go to DNG support and let's open up this shot. So full disclosure, I was looking for some DNG photos, so I found these on DP Review. So DP Review, I'm sure you know the site, but it's a great resource for nerding out and looking at shots from any sort of camera that you can think of. And what I wanted to do here was to find a DNG file from a camera that is not yet officially supported in Capture One. So this is a Sigma FP, which I've never used, but it's a really interesting little teeny tiny camera. By default, it shoots DNG. Now, before in Capture One, even if you had a camera shooting DNG, if we didn't specifically support the camera, and I'll explain what that means in a second, in Capture One, then you couldn't work with the DNG file. So what happens when we support a camera in Capture One is that we take it in-house. We obviously shoot color targets, we shoot skin tones of loads of different tones, colors, intensities, and so on. We shoot outdoor scenes, we shoot product in the studio, and then we hand tune the color profile to be the best that it can be for that camera and sensor combination. When it comes to DNG files, if they're not supported by Capture One, we use the DNG colors. So if we look in the base characteristics tool, which I probably got rid of, there it is, then it has the profile embedded in the DNG file neutral. If we do support the camera, like a Leica SL, for example, which I think shoots DNG, then it will have Capture One colors, which we perceive to be better. But this is a Sigma FP, as I said. Now, the nice smart thing that Sigma have done, I think they have a cooperation with Panasonic and Leica. There's enough raw data about the lens embedded into the DNG file so that we can already correct distortion. I doubt this distorts that much, but you can see without us having to do anything, it's already embedded in the DNG and we can correct for that lens distortion. All the other functionality works great. So for example, I was playing around with this yesterday. Again, thanks DP Review. This is from Barney Britton, I think. Thanks, Barney. Works great. I put a little radial mask on here just for fun. Check functionality. All the adjustments are working great. So if you do have DNG files from an unsupported camera or drone or mobile phone, I must try with my iPhone actually, making a DNG, then it will just slot straight into Capture One as well. So that's just a really nice additional thing to bring extra support into Capture One. Okay, for high volume shooters amongst you, let's go to the top. So we've got however many 70 shots here. Excuse me, this could be 700 of course, but for the high volume shooters amongst you, it's obviously a challenge to get through a lot of photos, star rate them or color tag them. So the fastest we can make that as possible is going to save you time in the long run. So in the select menu, you'll see a new feature called Select Next When, and this can either be when a photo is star rated or color tagged or both. So I'm just going to leave it set to star rated, and what happens is as soon as I star rate this photo, and I'm going to do it with just a keyboard shortcut on my keyboard. So let's say I'm going to rate this 3 stars. As soon as I hit 3, it advances to the next shot. So now I can quickly go through, and this is where you get the benefit of Capture One loading photos nice and quick, that as soon as I rate the photo, the next one is ready to go for. Now this also works with a nice feature in Capture One called sets. So let's say I bring up 4 photos at once, like so. Let's go back to the first one. I'm going to turn this toggle off, edit selected, which means that when I apply my star rating, it's only going to be applied to the first photo, not the entire selection. So I've turned that off. So let's rate this one. So let's call that 4 stars. It advances to the next. Let's go to 3 stars. And then I'm going to say 3. Now watch what happens when I rate this one. So as soon as I rate this one, Capture One will pick up the next 4 images in my collection. So as soon as I tap 3, straight away we've got the next 4 shots. So now, okay, which is great because if you're working with a lot of similar photos, sometimes it's quite nice to be able to see, and if I had a bigger monitor, I could do more than 4, I could see 6 up or 8 up at the same time, and then it makes that evaluation process a little bit easier. So once again, I can use my cursor keys to look at these and think, okay, this is going to be a 4, this will be a 5, that's a 5, that's a 5. So as soon as I rate this one, boom, next 4 pictures chosen, and so on. So the addition of that select next when feature in a combination with a set is a really powerful way to blast through a heavy quantity of shots. So that's select next when. As a reminder, you'll find that in the select menu right there. Same operation with color tags as well as star rating as well. Let's have a look at a few questions. Let's go to the Q&A tab. Let's see, filled layers with styles, also capture ones, will they react to the opacity slider? Yeah, so if you find a style, let's find a style. Let's have a look. Let's just go for this one. If I right click and say apply as new layer, look on my layers palette, I've now got my style layer. So if I think the style's just a bit strong, then we can just dial that back. So that's no style, 50% style, 100% like so. So some styles can be a bit heavy-handed on some photos. So this is a way of making a style a lot more flexible. Let's see. Is DNG from mobile supported on Capture One for Sony? Yes, Biniam, it will be. So if it's a DNG file from a Sony, should be no problem whatsoever. Can you copy and paste adjustments from one layer to another within the same photo? Oh, yes, you can. So I was like confused then. Why would you want to do that? But I see what you mean. So if we had a radial mask here, let's do a radial like so. And let's just change something. Let's just play around with that. Brightness or saturation. Then if we make another layer, who was asking, this is Greg. So right click on that layer and say copy mask from layer 1. So if we do that, then you see the radial popped up straight away. And that could be a gradient or a brush that you've painted on and so on. That wasn't really a Capture 120 question, so I went off track there, but that's a good question. Let's see. Okay, I think we pretty much pulled up that. I saw a couple of people asking about profiles for various lenses, specifically a Sony macro. Now, don't forget, so look, so we've got a profile which we made in-house for the 55mm, great lens, but there's also this manufacturer profile. Again, like the Sigma FP that we saw, there's enough data in the raw file itself to do that correction. So in your 90mm macro, just pick manufacturer profile. There's really not much to correct on it anyway. It's a brilliant lens. It doesn't really have any CA. It's super sharp. It doesn't really distort. So there's not really a great deal to correct on it. If you want to be really sort of picky, you can go to chromatic aberration and say analyze, and that will give you a bespoke analysis for the CA. But there's really no disadvantage of using manufacturer profile, so just pick that out. A few questions that I saw coming in, and poor Andre's fingers are probably bleeding by now. In terms of more specific workflow things, this webinar really is about what's new in Capture One. This time next week, I will do a sort of getting started, first few steps into Capture One, how to import, how to edit, how to export, batch operations, all that kind of workflow stuff, which I see Michael is asking about as well. So that's this time next week, and you can sign up on learn.captureone.com as well, in the same place that you signed up for this. So that would be great for any of you new who just want to kind of get into the mindset of how Capture One works. So every application is a bit different. So yeah, come along next week as well. All right, how are we doing for time? Pretty much out. And the last sort of thing I just mentioned, like any update, new camera support. So a few Canon models, Nikon, Leicas, new Panasonic S1H added, Pentax K1 Mark II, new Olympus M5, the Ricoh GR3, and a GoPro Hero 6, which is a great little action cam, of course. And a whole bunch of lenses added too. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps us up for today. I'm just checking your last questions. Let's see. Can you output a single particular layer? No. Interesting idea, but that's not possible. The Leica SL2 isn't there yet, Bill. But I know we have a pretty good relationship with Leica, so hopefully that should come along quickly as well. We're trying to speed up as much as we possible new camera support. There's more staff doing that these days. But as I explained earlier, we do spend a lot of time creating the camera profile. So we're a bit slower at adding support, but hopefully you'll see that the wait is worth it as well. The recording will be up tomorrow sometime. You'll also get an email when it's available too. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox, and then you'll be able to watch this all over again should you wish. And don't forget all the other learning content that we have. There's whole new tutorials for Capture 120 also up on the Learning Hub as well. And we're adding tutorials every week as well. You'll notice if you're not new to Capture One that as well as me making tutorials, I have my super friend and colleague Zoe Noble, a photographer in Berlin. She's also making tutorials for us as well, just to lighten the load a little bit and to give you, someone else's perspective too. So there we go. Many thanks for your time today. A pleasure for spending these 45-50 minutes with you, and hope to see you all again in the future. And any more questions, don't forget to hit us up on social media, support channels, and everything else as well. Take care and see you all again soon. Bye now.